What is up, everybody? My name is Hoang Zero, and today I have for you the brand new card game Elestrals. Elestrals is a card game that was designed by aDrive, who is a very well-known Pokemon YouTuber. This card game features a lot of old school style of gameplays where it's a lot of back and forth, and the game is very easy to get into on a fundamental level, but has a lot of advanced mechanics that make it so you can show off your skills. At the current moment, Elestrals is now on Kickstarter. You can back up Elestrals, and you can also look to order starter decks, booster sets, and whatnot. And I think the game is really good. It's a huge passion project. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this. For those of you that may not know me, my name is Hoang. I am a previous regional level Digimon champion. I am the previous national and world championship commentator as well for Digimon. So I like to believe I have a relatively good understanding of the card games in general. And so this video is called Pro Digimon Player Rates the Elestral Set 1 card game. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Now, before we get started on the video, I do want to say aDrive and his team have done a fantastic job designing a how to play guide. The QR code on the screen will take you directly to the guide itself. Going forward in this video, it is assumed that you have a basic understanding of the rules, and that will be the guideline of how we're going to rate the cards in the context of the game Elestrals itself, and then looking at it from the perspective of a pro Digimon player. So, without further ado, let's get started. So how we're going to go ahead and do it is that if a card has an evolution, or if the card has some sort of card in tangent to it, we're going to put it on the screen at the same time so that you have full context of what is happening. And so the first card we're going to talk about is Drtea. Drtea is a Earth Spirit that is a 2/4, and it states, when a player casts Ambrosia, you can draw 2 cards. Ambrosia itself is a 1-cost ruin. Return up to 3 spirits from your underworld to your spirit deck. So in this game, your health is also a resource, right? Every time you summon a creature, every time you activate a ruin, it all costs you health. So cards like Ambrosia, it returns your spirits from your underworld back to your spirit deck at the cost of 1 spirit. It fundamentally is a +2 to your health. In this game, what you'll notice is that unlike Digimon, where you're having the ability to draw additional cards every time you Digivolve, where you're making a break even, every time you cast a card in this game, you're not breaking even. It is fundamentally a -1 play. So, because of that, draw power is actually very valuable, it seems, looking at it from a first glance. And so cards like Drtea, that draw 2 can be very helpful. But then you look at Drtea also, that the fact that it requires an additional card in order to gain immediate value. Without the Ambrosia to be casted, Drtea is simply a 2/4 creature, and that's okay. I think in the grand scheme of things. I think if we rate this on a scale of 1 to 10, I think Drtea itself is a really solid 4 out of 10, okay? And then I do think Ambrosia itself, however, is actually a very solid, I think this is a 7 out of 10. And so, obviously, I haven't played a ton of Elestrals in comparison to some other people that have been playing this game since way before, but this is how I'm perceiving it. Drtea, the reason why I give it a 4 out of 10 is the draw power is nice, the stat line is not too shabby, but it does require an additional card to go alongside it, and if you don't have that additional card, it is essentially a vanilla, whereas Ambrosia, it is fundamentally a heal 2, but not only a heal 2, it is a recover 2 resources. And I think that sounds pretty strong, actually. And so Lotogon is 7/8. It costs 2 spirits to go into, so you will have to ascend into it. And it states, when a player casts Ambrosia or Golden Apple of Discord, you can target and destroy a card. And then the Golden Apple of Discord, discard a card from your hand in order to discard a card from your opponent's hand at random and send the top 2 cards of their deck to the underworld. So, talking about the Golden Apple of Discord first, this actually seems like a really strong card. So, like I said, card draw seems a little bit, lacking in the terms of this game in comparison to something, say, like Digimon, right? And being that is the case, being able to discard your opponent's card sounds pretty strong if they're not able to, recover that. But unfortunately, you do have to discard your own card as well, so that is a bit of a drawback. And then milling the top 2 cards of their deck can also be very powerful. If you manage to go ahead and mill a card like an Important Ascension, that could be really huge. And then in combination with Lotogon, when you cast Ambrosia or the Golden Apple, you can pop a card. Lotogon himself is a 7/8 stat line. That is pretty beefy. I think the biggest thing to note is that with Lotogon, if you were to cast the Golden Apple of Discord, while you yourself is a -1 tempo play, you inflict onto your opponent a -2 tempo play, and potentially more depending on how many spirits are attached to the card that you remove, right? If it's another Elestral, for example, that you pop, or maybe it's a Ruin in the back row. Either way, it actually has a lot of tempo. So I think the Golden Apple of Discord itself, I think this is a 6 out of 10 because you have to discard your own card. If it was just a flat discard your opponent's card from hand, this would be much higher rated because this is fundamentally, it also negs yourself, and hand draw is a bit, you know, I feel like, I guess the word I'm looking for is a bit short. That is something to take into account. And then Lotogon itself, I think this is a really good card. It is a very easy card to ascend into, assuming one of your Earth Spirits does survive. 7-8 is a fantastic stat line, especially in the defense position, and then being able to pop something on your opponent's board. And it's not once per turn. And it's, you know, whether it's Ambrosia or Golden Apple Discord, I think Lotogon is a 7 out of 10. It suffers similarly to Drataya, where it does require an additional card to make a play, and without that additional card, it is just a 7-8 creature. But Lotogon, because it does have that much beefier stat line, it's a very easy ascension, and because of what the payout is when you do cast the effect, I think it's pretty good. Alright, and then up next we do have Rumagem and Scavagem. Rumagem is a 4/4. When you normal cast this Rumagem, you can search your deck for an Elestral with an enchantment cost of 1 Earth added to your hand. Rumagem reads really fantastic to me. Having a 4/4 stat line is pretty good early game, as well as the fact that you can basically replenish the cost that you would have made to normal cast the Rumagem. To me, this seems like a very easy 8 out of 10, solely because of the fact that he is... Your hand size doesn't necessarily decrease, and you can grab whatever 1 cost Elestral you're looking for. And then Scavagem is 4/6. When you ascend into the Scavagems, expend 1 Earth in order to search your deck for up to 2 cards with enchantment cost of 1 or 2. So Scavagem is pretty interesting. The fact that you are able to search out your deck for a potential ascension in the future is really nice. My only issue with this card is the fact that it takes up your ascension in order to do this, and it's not exactly the most proactive ascension, so you're essentially wasting a turn of ascension in order to search out your deck. That seems okay. I would definitely say this Scavagem to me seems like a 6 out of 10, solely off the virtue of the fact that you're wasting an ascension to do a more slow line of play rather than a more proactive line of play that a lot of decks may just punish you for. Next up, we do have Spiny and Spinosect. So, or Spideium. It's a 1/5, 1 Earth Spirit. When this Spideium is destroyed in battle, you can cast it as an artifact empowering the Elestral that destroyed it. With the effect, the empowered Elestral has 0 base. And then Spinosect is this, it's a 1/9, by the way, with 1 Earth and 1 Wind. This Spinosect can attack in defense position as though it's an attack position. If it does, it uses defense for calculations. So, Spideium, it's actually very interesting. It's almost like a parasite where it latches on to your opponent's Elestral and then reduces their base power. That does set you up for punishing your opponent on the following turn. So that's actually pretty interesting, I would definitely say. And then Spinosect is just this big, beefy beater. Being 1/9 means that you will never actually end up taking damage to your spirit deck because you will be in the defense position, and you're going to be dealing essentially 9 attack every single time you're on the offense. So looking at Spiny, because this is a more reactive card than it is a proactive card, in a situation where your opponent has just summoned an Elestral and they're looking to go on the offense, if you go into this card, if this is your card draw for the turn, what ends up happening is that you aren't able to contest your opponent for tempo. This is a very reactive card. If your opponent decides to not destroy this Spiny, then you lose a lot of value in the card. Yes, you could potentially ram this card into your opponent's Elestral, but you'll be doing so at a deficit of spirit, and so this card seems okay. I think this is like a 3 out of 10. I could be very wrong. I could definitely see this card having a lot of potential, but just the fact that it's such a reactive card rather than a proactive card does make me a little weary. Spinosect, on the other hand, I'm kind of biased towards insects, I'm not gonna lie, but just the fact that it's a 1/9 beater, it's very simple, it's very efficient. I feel like most creatures will require some kind of equip to break over this, and even then you can equip something to Spinosect to make it even stronger. I think Spinosect itself looks like an 8 out of 10. I will be honest, this card reads really, really well. I really do like this. I think Spinosect is definitely a very strong card to ascend into. Next up, we do have Globi. Globi is a 2/2. When this Globi receives one or more Earth Spirits, you can draw a card. Globi, very similar to Rumagem, will replenish its cost, but Rumagem searches a specific card, whereas Globi just draws you a flat-out card. That flat-out card could be a field, a counter, an artifact, etc. So Globi, for an Earth Elestral, not too shabby. I would say this is probably a 8 out of 10. Just for the fact that it does get you a little bit of early game advantage. And then Sakurasaur, it's a 6/8, expend 1 Earth in order to draw 2 cards. It's fundamentally Pot of Greed, but with a 6/8 body. Not too bad. I think in the early game, this could be a very powerful card. I would say the fact that it doesn't do anything super proactive, so if it got removed on the following turn, that can be really, really dangerous. So I would definitely say Sakurasaur, cautiously, I would give this a 7 out of 10, only because you use up an Ascension for a non-proactive play. Next up, we do have 2 Earth Elestrals. They do not evolve into one another. They are just standalone Elestrals. Tectarus is a 3/2, 1 cost Earth Spirit. And it states this Tectarus gets +1 attack for each enchanting Earth Spirit on the board. So with 1 Earth Spirit to summon it, it is a 4/2. With any additional Earth Spirits, like say from a field spell or from an equip, this could ramp up very quickly. This card actually seems like it can get out of hand very fast. If you do have the proper setup, if you do have the draw power to facilitate getting the pieces necessary, I can see this being a very strong beat stick that is difficult for your opponent to break over. If I had to give this card a rating, I definitely see this card as a 7 out of 10. I think in a situation where you're dead drawing a little bit, the card is only it's more or less a 4/2 vanilla, and that doesn't seem very very powerful. But in having other cards to support it, like field spell equips, etc., gods even, right? I know Demeter, I believe, equips 3 spirits, and we'll get to that in a bit. But with that context in mind, this card can actually get very, very big fast. My only concern with this card is that it's only a beat stick, and that might be just more than enough actually in early game Elestrals. You know what? I'm saying it out loud, and I actually do want to change my score. I actually do think this is an 8 out of 10. I will give it just because I think because we're so early on into Elestral, I think having a strong beat stick for 1 cost is going to be very valuable. And then Barabog is a card you do have to ascend to. It's a Earth Spirit and a Water Spirit. It is a 3/7. When your opponent casts an Elestral or Ruin without Earth or Water, they must expend an additional Spirit. And so I don't know. This is actually a pretty interesting card. So this to me reads like a meta card in a format where Earth or Water is not very popular. I can see Barabog inflicting attacks sort of playstyle. But given the fact that most likely in set 1 a lot of the decks are very balanced, it's unlikely that we will see a true tier 1 come out anytime soon. It'll probably be very balanced across the board, and so because of that, I think Barabog is a 4 out of 10. I think the niche is very interesting. Actually, I think it's probably a 3 out of 10. I think the niche is very interesting, but it has a lot of counterplay to it, and of course your opponent also could very well just decide to misenchant, in which case they would play around the Barabog, and then they can destroy the Barabog in combat. And that would also be a very feasible answer, right? Because in Elestrals, even though it costs an Earth Spirit, that does not necessarily mean you have to pay with an Earth Spirit. You can instead decide to pay with a Wind Spirit, for example. Yes, this would be countered as a misenchantment, and you would not get the ability, but you get the creature on the board, and that's what matters the most sometimes. And that's a bit of a resource game, right? And so because your opponent can just purposely misenchant and then destroy the Barabog in combat, say equipping with an equip, I think Barabog is actually a pretty mediocre card. And so we do have 2 more Elestrals, Equalnix. is a 4/3, 1 Earth Spirit. You can Nexus up to 2 Earth Spirits. When you do, you can target and destroy a Ruin. So if you don't know what Nexus means you're able to reallocate 2 whatever spirit specifies from the board to a target of your choice. So for example, if I have 2 Earth Spirits underneath a Demeter or God in the future on my board, I can Nexus 2 of those spirits to a different card of my choice. Whether that means to the Equalix itself, maybe to my field, or maybe to an equip, whatever it may be. This card is fundamentally a Mystical Space Typhoon on legs, if you're able to provide the cost. That actually seems pretty strong. Granted that you do have to have some previous setup to Nexus successfully. And then I think because of that and the 4/3 stat line, I do think this is a... I would say this is probably a 7 out of 10. And the reason why I say it's a 7 out of 10 is because the amount of cards that I can actually Nexus at the current moment in set 1 is not super high. And because of that, I think having a card that can Nexus and that also comes with back row removal is pretty valuable in early set. And then Titano stock is 1/3. As long as this Titano stock is enchanted, opponents play with their hands revealed. This just seems like a gimmick. I don't think this is a very good card. Even if you know what your opponent may have in their hand, this is a very easy card to remove, and then they would go back to hiding their hand. Yeah, I don't think this is a very good card. I think this is probably the first 1 out of 10. I'm not a fan of gimmicks like this. I think instead of playing a gimmick like this, you're better off having summoned, say, a Scara Gem or a Ruma Gem, right? Better off summoning a Ruma Gem, or better off summoning even Equalix, right? So now we do have Vicerus, 4/2, Earth Spirit. This Vicerus gains +1 attack for each Vicerus on the field. When this Vicerus destroys an Elestral in battle, you can special cast a Vicerus from your hand or deck in defense position. So this is trying to act as a flood. It's trying to create multiple bodies that are just supposed to power themselves up. Of course, you can only have up to 3 copies of an Elestral in your deck, which does mean that at most Vicerus can get up to 7 attack, because it counts itself. So Vicerus is a 5/2, including itself. If you decide to disenchant, then it's a 4/2. Summoning a Vicerus, however, or when you summon a Vicerus from your deck, when you special cast it, it does come in defense position, which does mean you are unable to attack with it on that turn, because there is no summoning sickness in this game, but it's in defense position, right? So that's actually, good job on the game design, guys. Fantastic. I think Vicerus being a 5/2 that is able to flood the board, what that means is that you enable easier ascension in the future. Because when you want to ascend, you do have to have a creature on the board from a previous turn, and then you do not normal cast, you would instead ascend on that turn. So because of that, Vicerus is very fantastic at setting that up, unless your opponent clears you out. I think Vicerus, to me, it looks like a very easy 9 out of 10. I really like this card. I like what it does in the context of Elestrals, and again, I could be very wrong, but I think one of the biggest things to Elestral is being able to find an easier way to achieve that ascension. I think Vicerus is one of the, if not the easiest way to ascend for Earth. And then Pandason, 1/4, you can disenchant an Earth Spirit from this Pandason in order to return an Invoke Ruin from your underworld to your hand. I mean, this seems okay. It grabs back a Ruin that you've previously used. Of course, your opponent will know what Ruin you grab back, which means that they will have knowledge going forward. But being able to retrieve and reuse certain things like Pandora's Box or like Shield, I think can be very useful. This, in the grand scheme of things, is probably a... let me think. So the Invoke Runes are actually very strong in what they accomplish. It makes it so your opponent has a lot less breathing room, a lot less flexibility in their plays. Even if their opponent knows what it may be, just having that extra security can be very problemsome unless they have some form of back row removal, and if they don't, then they have to deal with this painful decision, right? Whether or not to proc the Invoke Ruin or whether to concede tempo. So in that context, I actually do think this could be a good card. Now, the only downside, however, is when an Elestral no longer has a spirit, it is sent to the underworld, and because of that, Pandason, more often than not, is likely to be a 1-for-1 unless you were to Nexus a different spirit to this card. Because this card ends up sending itself to the underworld via having no spirit to sustain itself, I do think this is a 5. It's probably a 5 out of 10. I think if the card retained its board presence, I think this would be much higher. But the fact that it does remove itself from play, I do not like that. That leaves you susceptible. And it also requires you to have an Evoke Ruin in your Underworld. If you don't, it's like, let's say this is a very early play that you've decided to make, then this card just loses value. It's essentially a vanilla, and I'm not a big fan of that style of play. I want to be much more proactive, like the Vicerus. Now, we're out of Earth, we're into Fire, and the first Fire card we're going to talk about is Necroft. Necroft is a 5-1. When this Necroft destroys an opponent's Elestral in battle, that opponent must expend 1 spirit from their deck. 5-1 stat line is really fantastic just to begin with. Forcing your opponent to burn a spirit is pretty nice. I think overall, as an opener card, an opener Elestral especially, it's really good just off the stat line alone. Excuse me. Off the stat line alone. So I would say this is probably a 7 out of 10 only because it relies specifically on the fact that its stat line is so beefy. Blazer Rust, 7-2. This can attack twice during the battle phase. When it destroys 2 Elestrals in the same battle phase, special ascend into Trifernal from your hand or deck. Just off the bat, I mean, the fact that you can attack twice gives you a lot of leeway to playing this card. I think automatically this is a really solid 9 out of 10. It's very easy for you to get a lot of value with this card because you can destroy an Elestral and then immediately you can attack your opponent's spirit deck directly for 2 damage. If not, you can destroy a bunch of cards on their board. You can power up the Blazerus. It's just a really strong stat stick in general. And then Trifernal, 14-3, geez. And then expend a Fire from your spirit deck to give a Elestral they cast a -3 defense. If they reduce this to 0, it is destroyed. This is an absolutely phenomenal pseudo floodgate, if you will. If once you destroy their special ascended Elestral or an ascended Elestral, and they have to play something in order to get it to stick on the board to ascend later on, and if you pop it with Trifernal, and I mean, like, this is a 10 out of 10 card if you are able to get into it. Of course, the biggest thing is that you have to ascend twice in order to get into Trifernal, but Blazerus does have that ability to special ascend into it. So your opponent has to be very wary not to give the Blazerus player the ability to go into the Trifernal. So actually, saying that out loud, instead of a 10 out of 10, I would say this is probably a 9 out of 10, purely off of the virtue of the fact that you do have to ascend twice or special ascend into this most likely. And so now we do have the 4 bears, Scout, Seer, Smog, and Majesty. So Scout is 1-3. When this Scout is destroyed in battle, you can special cast an Scout, Smog, or Seer from your hand or deck in defense position. That already reads really fantastic because that does mean you are going to have a much easier time to ascend in the future. But being specifically tied to Scout, Smog, or Seer does mean that there is a bit of a deck building constraint. Of course, you could just run 3 Scout and call that a day. I would imagine that's totally fine. Looking at it as Ascension fodder specifically, I could see Scout being very solid, but the fact that it is not generic, unlike certain other Elestrals we've previously seen, the fact that it can only summon specified names, I do think this is a 6 out of 10. Looking at Seer, a 4-1. When this Seer destroys an Elestral in battle, you can special cast an Scout, Smog, or Seer from your hand or deck. So while Scout is a much more reactive card, Seer is a more proactive card, but it does hinge on the fact that you have to destroy an Elestral. Going off the theme of the Fire Elestral so far, it does look like you play a lot of aggression. And so, with that in mind, I would definitely say that Seer is, if Scout is a 6 out of 10, I would say Seer is a 7 out of 10. Just because it is a more proactive card, it doesn't rely on your opponent playing into it. And the 4-1 stat line does mean that it is more difficult to remove from the game. So it has a higher chance to stick onto the board. And then, for example, if you have the Earth Seer and you summon Earth Scout, if they remove the Earth Scout, then you get another insert Earth here, and so you're almost guaranteed to ascend at that point, right? Vice versa, I guess actually when you have Earth Scout, if you destroy the Earth Scout, you can summon it into another Earth Scout, and you also guarantee ascension. So actually looking at it from that perspective, I take it all back. I think Earth Scout is actually a 7 out of 10. And I think Earthseer is also... Earthseer is actually probably the 6 out of 10. And I know I talked a lot about reactive and proactive, but Earth Scout is more likely to guarantee an ascension, whereas Earthseer, if your opponent does not have an Elestral on the board, suddenly it becomes a reactive card. And so because of that logic, I think Earth Scout is actually the better of the two. And then Earthmog, expend a fire in order to special cast an Earth Scout, Earthmog, or Earthseer from your hand in attack position. Well, 1, it can only summon from the hand. 2, it would remove itself because it no longer has a spirit to maintain. This is probably the weakest of the 3. To me, this screams 3 out of 10. The fact that the only reason it's not a 1 out of 10 is because there is some synergy with the Earth Scout and Earthseer. And then Majesty, oh my god, it has 3 cost to ascend. 12/12. It gets +2 attack for every Earth Scout, Earthmog, or Earthseer on your field. Your Earth Scout, Earthmog, and Earthseers cannot be attacked and cannot be targeted by your opponent's card effect. I guess if you play Bear Tribal, this could be good. If you're not playing Bear Tribal, this is not a good card for obvious reasons. To me, this screams a 4 out of 10. Majority of its score is stemming off the fact that it is a 12/12 body. That is the biggest thing. If it wasn't for the 12/12 body, if it were much smaller, I would definitely not rate this card as highly, just because it is so specific. It's not a generic card, and you have to be mindful of that when you are constructing a deck. Next up, we do have Ignactar and Waspire. Ignactar is a 1/2. When you normal cast this Ignactar, you can special cast up to 2 Ignactars from your hand or deck in attack position with fire. If you do, you must skip your battle phase. Ignactar is going to get out 3 Elestrals fundamentally onto the board at once. If your opponent is not able to deal with that, you have a lot of gas to work with. That's very easy ascension on the following turn. That's also a very easy line of defense that your opponent does have to break through. Ignactar to me reads very strong. Yes, you do have to skip your battle phase, but hypothetically, if you open Ignactar going first, you are in an amazing position because, of course, you don't get a battle phase going first. So if you open Ignactar going first, fantastic. Even if you open it going second, I guess going second, it's not that good. Like, yes, you guarantee the fact that you're going to get 3 bodies and you can ascend. The downside is that you're almost guaranteeing your opponent will be able to counter ascend on their turn, and if their ascension is able to remove your Ignactars, granted the fact that they do have to remove 3 bodies to deny the ascension, Ignactar to me reads like a very strong 8 out of 10. I think having such flexibility and almost guaranteeing an ascension, as well as having additional bodies that your opponent will have to deal with in the future, I think is very good. Waspire. You can disenchant 1 fire from an Ignactar or Waspire to force an opponent to expend double spirits. This effect can be activated any number of times on your turn. Waspire is a 5/1. This is pretty interesting. This is very much so a burn playstyle. So if you have the triple Ignactar that your opponent doesn't clear it, you go into Waspire. You can double burn 2 Waspire, 2 fire spirits from the Waspires in order to mill 4 spirits from your opponent's deck. That's pretty good. The downside, however, is the fact that it is very specific. It has to be Ignactar, it has to be Waspire. If you don't have either of those on your board, or for example, if you burn 1 from the Waspire, yes, you burn 2, but then you will have to spend an additional turn reinvesting spirits into the Waspire. Unlike Ignactar, which is, it's very generic, Waspire is a much more constrained card. So to me, this reads like a 5 out of 10. One of the biggest drawbacks is the fact that its stat line for an ascended card is pretty low, being a 5/1. Yes, you get to burn 2 up to potentially 4 spirits from your opponent, or I guess 6 actually. If you decide to burn 1 Ignactar, 2 Ignactar, and then 1 fire spirit off the Waspire itself, so up to 6 actually. That's not too bad, but again, it is very constrained in what it wants to accomplish. And so personally, I would like to see a little bit more flexibility from this card. I think at most, maybe it's a 6 out of 10. I think a 6 out of 10 would be fine, but yeah, I think Ignactar is definitely the better of the two. So the next cards we're going to look at, Warmite and Flaracne. Warmite is 3-1. You can target an opponent's Elestral and give it -4 attack until the end phase. This is really good at punishing your opponent's Elestrals. If you have any way to pop Elestrals based on their attacks, maybe for example if an Elestral has 3 or less attack, or 2 or less attack, or something along those, or maybe even a modified attack, I can see Warmite being very interesting. Warmite, if it really can't interact with an opponent's Elestral if it's in the defense position, because of that, I think Warmite is a very solid. I think it's a solid 5 out of 10. If your opponent's Elestral is in the attack position, Warmite is very likely to beat over it, but of course Warmite is very susceptible to being destroyed on the following turn during your opponent's turn, and the fact that it can't really interact with defense position Elestrals does hurt it a bit. And Flaracne, 4-8, as long as this Flaracne is enchanted, Elestrals cannot attack the turn they are cast unless they are fire enchanted. So this is very, this is not a good card in the mirror. This is a very, very good card outside of the mirror, unless of course your opponent decides to misenchant and then beat over the Flaracne. But the likelihood that they're able to misenchant as well as have enough stats to break over 4-8, I don't think is very likely. So I think as a means to stall out your opponent, this is a 7 out of 10. This reads as like a really good card. Of course, not in the mirror. In the mirror, it's not so good. But even then, it's a 4-8 wall, which could be very useful. I think the general purpose is the fact that it is a sort of pseudo, not a pseudo Swords the Revealing Light, if you will, if you know Yu-Gi-Oh. Yeah, that's pretty good, I think. All right, and then we do have Leo and Leonite. Leo is 3-1. You can Nexus up to 2 fire. When you do, target and destroy an opponent's Elestral. Very, very good. I was talking about earlier, a lot of your fire spirits do have a bit of an upkeep to them. The fact that they have a lot of abilities that require you to remove fire spirits from specific Elestrals. Leo immediately reads like a fantastic card, and it also destroys an Elestral on top of that. So if your opponent has this big Ascended Elestral, you can go into Leo, Nexus, and then pop. Nah, Leo, this is a 10 out of 10. I think this is our first 10 out of 10. This card reads phenomenal as a Nexus. And then Leonite is a 7-2. Or actually, wait, I take it back. Leo is... Leo, the fact that it itself is kind of weak, so if you decide to Leo at first, it's a 9 out of 10. The missing one is because of the fact that it by itself is not very strong. It has to work in tangent with another card. But when it does, man, is it really good. And then Leonite, as long as this Leonite is in attack position, players cannot cast Invoke Ruins, 7-2. So this, if we have to make a comparison to Yu-Gi-Oh, it's Senko Deca. If you make a comparison, yeah, that's basically it. It's just Senko Deca, right? So 7-2, this card is, it looks pretty good. Being able to nullify Invoke Ruins, I guess it really depends on how common Invoke Ruins are going forward into the game. I would definitely say having a 7-2 stat line is also pretty nice. This is likely a, I would say a 8 out of 10. And the reason why I say that is because A, it's a really big beater, and so likely it can beat over your opponent's Elestral, which denies them potential Ascension to counter back. It denies your opponent's Invoke Ruin, so you don't have to walk into, say, a Shield or Pandora's Box or whatever it may be. That can be very, very powerful, I would think. So having that flexibility looks pretty good. I definitely like these two cards. These two cards are very strong. And now we do have Cinder. Cinder is 3-2. When this Cinder receives 1 or more Fire Spirits, your opponent must send the top 3 cards from their deck to the Underworld. Deck out is a win condition, but if this is the only card that decks out or mills your opponent's deck, that doesn't seem very feasible. This seems more like a gimmick or potentially something later down the line. In its current form, this is a 3 out of 10. I don't think it really contributes to the game plan of Fire. Empirics. 3-3, when this Empirics is in your Underworld during an opponent's end phase, you can expend 1 fire in order to special cast it. Again, very good card. The fact that it is able to have permanent recursion, by the way, so if you have 1 in the trash, or 1 in the Underworld, you're able to bring it back. I assume if you have multiple, if you have 3 Empirics, for example, in your Underworld, you can resummon all 3. That seems really, really good. This card, to me, screams, I would definitely say 9 out of 10. it's just super easy Ascension material. I don't know. And then Volcaries. It gets +1 attack for each enchanting fire on the field, similar to Tectarus from Earth, where again you were just this really big beef stick. I think this also can be a very, very good card just in the context of being a huge beef stick. So I would definitely say this is probably an 8 out of 10 in the same way that Tectarus was, just because it's so early into the game that stat sticks matter so much. So moving on to the water Elestrals now, we do have Crack Kid as our first water Elestral, 2/2. When you cast this Crack Kid, you can target an Elestral on your opponent's field. That Elestral cannot attack, and its effect is negated as long as this Crack Kid is enchanted. The issue with this card I do see is the fact that yes, you can stun out an opponent's Elestral, but if they summon an Elestral on their normal cast, they will be able to destroy the Crack Kid, and then that Elestral will be able to attack the one that I previously stunned. That doesn't seem very good to me. It's also a 2/2 stat line, so it's also very easy to remove in general. So likely this card is not sticking around. To me, this reads like a 2 out of 10. It's just not a very good card. Crack King, however, 5 out of 6, or not 5 out of 6, but 5/6. When you cast this Crack King, you can target up to 2 unoccupied slots in an opponent's Elestral row. Those Elestral slots cannot be used as this Crack King is enchanted. So this to me reads more like a meta call rather than a good staple. If you're against a deck that is playing Ignactar, for example, where they can't summon 2 of their Ignactars, this could be really, really good, being able to deny that play. Or for example, if you're playing against the Bears, maybe you can play deny your opponent summoning their Bears. Cracking to me seems very niche, very situational, not a very good generic staple. This is a 4 out of 10. This reminds me of Ojamas from Yu-Gi-Oh! So take that how you will. Next up, we do have Sluggle, Globi, and Majesty. Sluggle is 2/2. When you cast a Sluggle, you can return up to 3 water spirits from your underworld to your spirit deck. Fundamentally, this is, again, similar to Ambrosia, where this is a +2 to your resource / health, but at the cost of your normal cast. Sluggle seems very, very slow. I don't know how often I would actually want to invest using my normal cast for Sluggle. To me, this reads very close to a 4 out of 10 or a 5 out of 10, but I'll give it the benefit of the doubt because it's kind of cute, so 5 out of 10. Globi is 4/8. You can return up to 2 water spirits from your underworld to your spirit deck. Again, do I really want to waste my ascension on returning 2 spirits to the underworld? I guess in the terms of recursion, this could be very potentially good, but I'm sure there are better cards we could ascend to. So similar to Sluggle, I do think Globi is a 5 out of 10. Actually, 4/8 stat line, but the issue is the fact that it does cost you an ascension to go into this. So this is actually probably a 4 out of 10, just because this does consume an ascension. And then Majesty, 6/14. This gets +1 attack for every enchanting water spirit on your board. Water Elestrals on your field cannot be targeted by an opponent's Elestral effect. This seems like a pretty good payout for a boss card. I'd imagine by this point in time, you'll have enough water spirits to ramp this up. If not, a 14 defense is very hard to break through. And then having immunity to Elestral effects is actually very, very good as a boss card. So good job, Majesty. You've managed to salvage this line, 8 out of 10. Definitely really like that card. Next up, we do have Foamy. Foamy is a 2/2. When this Foamy is destroyed in battle, you can special cast an Elestral with enchantment cost 1 water from your deck in defense position. Very akin to the previous Elestrals where we talked about guaranteeing that ascension. Foamy falls within the same realm. Foamy, of course, is tied to 1-cost water Elestrals. However, it's any 1-cost water Elestral. It's very easy to destroy, which is unfortunate, but that is totally fine. But the fact that it does have to call in defense position, that may have implications going on to the future. But I think as a turn 1 play, Foamy is probably an 8 out of 10, almost guaranteed to ascend. And then Caprigal is 7/4. When this Caprigal destroys an Elestral in battle, you can special summon an Elestral with an enchantment cost of 1 water from your underworld in defense position. This looks like a very strong card for you to ascend into. It pays itself off very quickly. 7/4 is a very solid stat line. You can, of course, buff it up with an equip or with the field spell, and then being able to summon a new body, which your opponent will have to deal with. Caprigal, unlike Globi, you are definitely worth the ascension. 8 out of 10. There we go. Whoop. Whoop. There you go. Next, we have Typhlant. Typhlant is 2/2. When you cast this Typhlant, you can discard a card from your opponent's hand at random. This is very akin to the Golden Apple of Discord. But unlike that card, this card is a creature, so it's advancing your board state. B, it doesn't require you to discard your own card. As an early game card, I don't see a lot of like super good value from this card. I think the biggest thing about this is the fact that if your opponent does not have the card draw to get back into the game, this could just be a really good hand sniper. If you're able to keep up the hand size in comparison to your opponent, this could be a very strong card. I think this, as a standalone for hand sniping, given that the game has such low draw power, and yes, you can forsake your normal Ascension / cast for an additional draw, and that's totally fine, but like, again, your opponent's not advancing their board state and you're getting ahead. That means they're not dealing with the Typhlant. This is probably a 7 out of 10. Just because it does hinge on the fact that your opponent is not able to recover or restabilize. Of course, you could just snipe those cards from your opponent's hand, but it is at random, so do keep that in mind. And then Ivory, haha, funny. 2 cost 6/8. This Ivory gets +2 for every Typhlant in your underworld. You can expend 1 water in order to special cast a Typhlant from your underworld in attack position. The two combined are actually very strong. So okay. It's kind of weird. So 1 Ivory does get additional attack power for every Typhlant in the underworld, but it wants to also summon them from the underworld, so it would then lose the 2 power, so I guess you really have to make that decision. But being able to summon the Typhlant does mean that you will be able to recycle the discard effect. To me, this reads very close to a 5 out of 10. The reason why is because A, it's almost counterintuitive of what it wants to accomplish as a card. B, is very specific. It can only grab Typhlant. It can't grab anything else. So yeah. Next card coming up, we do have Small Tsuka and Krakatuga. Small Tsuka is a 2/5 water Elestral that states when you normal cast a Small Tsuka, you can search your deck for an Elestral with an enchantment cost of 1 water and add it to your hand. Obviously, this is one of those things where tutoring any specific Elestral within this category is really good. It replaces itself. It has a really strong stat line. Small Tsuka, to me, off the bat, immediately screams really solid 8 out of 10, especially for consistency. The only issue is that it's probably really easy to break over. So the lack of Ascension potentially becomes an issue, but Small Tsuka being a strong tutor engine in the deck could be really good. And then Krakatuga is a 4/9 Water Fire Elestral that states you can expend double fire to force an opponent to expend triple spirit. 4/9 is a pretty solid stat line, but having to expend double fire is kind of scary. It essentially means that you're giving up quite a bit of resources in order for you to go ahead and get rid of 3 of your opponent's spirits. So this card can sometimes be a hit or miss depending. The cost is a bit steep, so I definitely would say that this card is probably somewhere, I would say safely 6 out of 10. Stat line is very solid. The ability is really nice, but it doesn't actively do anything to the board state. It's not a very proactive card, right? So I think it's the biggest thing holding it back. Next up, we do have Veruqua. This card is a 3/1. When this card enters battle with a defense position Elestral, you can negate the effect and destroy it. If you do, this is Veruqua, deals no damage this battle. This card is absolutely really strong, it feels like, in a more simplified format. When there aren't a lot of power cards and you have to, play around the attack position, defense position, and you have a lot of cards that like to float, for example, the Bears and Fire, or cards like the Foamy and Water. This card is really strong. Also, if your opponent, say, has like a really bulky stat line, like a 4/9, for example, as a blocker, Veruqua will just immediately destroy it. This card, to me, feels like a very strong 9 out of 10. The only issue is that if the opponent has an attack position, Elestral, then obviously it kind of falls flat on itself. But for the most part, this card is a very strong thing that your opponent has to deal with, it feels like. In Javalantis 6/3, when this Javalantis destroys an opponent's defense position Elestral in battle, that opponent must expend 3 additional spirits from their spirit deck. So basically this is a burn 3. This card can be very, very strong, but it has to be against a defense position Elestral. Unlike Veruqua, where you don't have to make an initial heavy investment, Javalantis does have to make an investment that then has to be reciprocated by a defense position Elestral being on the board. I can see the potential of Javalantis, but definitely it's not as easy to use as Veruqua, so I would give this card a 7 out of 10. Next up, we do have Tadpuff and Zephyrog. Tadpuff is a 1/1. You can expend 1 Water Spirit in order to special cast this Tadpuff from your hand in attack position with 1 Water Spirit. This actually seems pretty good. Sorry, the writing's from the previous cards, but this actually seems pretty good. The fact that you can special summon or special cast Tadpuff does mean that you did not consume your special ascension for the turn. So that's actually really great fodder. So this alone screams to me 8 out of 10, just for being easy Ascension. And then Zephyrog is a 4/3 Water Wind. This Zephyrog can attack an opponent's Spirit deck directly. Okay. When the Zephyrog deals damage to an opponent, you can look at the opponent's hand and discard a card. This reads pretty good when you combine it with the Tadpuff. You deal 2 damage to their Spirit deck directly, and then you can discard a card as well. If you do have a card such as like the Trident, for example, that can buff up your Zephyrog and make it difficult for your opponent to deal with, especially early game. This could be very, very dangerous. Of course, if you do attack your opponent's Spirit deck directly, that does mean that you're potentially leaving a body on their board to ascend with, so you keep that in mind. But Zephyrog, to me, reads like a very strong early game card that has a lot of disruption to your opponent. So to me, this reads like an 8 out of 10. Of course, the 2 that's missing is because of the fact that if you do attack your opponent's Spirit deck directly, that you do leave a body for them to potentially ascend with, and that can be kind of scary. Now, the next 3 cards, Mount Station, Galaxia, and Aferos. Mount Station is a 1/6. You can expend 1 Water Spirit in order to swap this Mount Station's attack with its defense until the end phase. This effect can also be activated when an opponent normal casts an Elestral. This card is very interesting. At times it can be a 6/1, otherwise it can be a 1/6, depending on what you need. But the fact that once it's in a certain position and then you've committed to that position, its effect kind of feels redundant. To me, this seems more like a really cool gimmick card, but other than that, like if you swing for 6/1 and you leave it on you leave it on your board, and then it goes to your opponent's turn, and then you have to expend an additional Spirit in order to become another 6/1. It seems kind of gimmicky a little bit. And that also relies on the fact that your opponent has a normal cast in Elestral in order for you to re-trigger the 1/6, or to the flip, right? So to me, this seems kind of like a 1/6. This is a 6 out of 10, because, I mean, 6/1 is not too bad. Galaxia, 2/5, as long as this Galaxia is enchanted, swap each Water Enchanted Elestral's attack with its defense. So the 2 are supposed to go hand in hand together, right? Or it's supposed to permanently make the Mount Station into a 6/1, and that's pretty nifty. I guess if you have the 2 hand in hand with one another, it's kind of good. Galaxia also is pretty interesting for the fact that, if you've noticed, a lot of Water Elestrals just have a strong defense to begin with, right? Krakatoa, or the turtle, right? It was a 4/9, for example. So you'd be making that into a 9/4. So I think this card is actually very interesting if you're able to make it stick. And so if by itself, with its effect online, it is a 5/2 essentially. But getting it to stick is one thing. I would say this card is probably a 6 out of 10, just because it's a card that by itself does not do a lot. It relies on other pieces. And Aferos, it is the nexus of water. It draws you 2 cards. This card seems insanely good. Replenishing hand size, being able to nexus cards up, fantastic, just across the board. Now, we do have electric Elestrals. Boombat, 2/1. You can disenchant 1 electric from this Boombat in order to target and destroy an opponent's Elestral. So this is, ultimately a 1-for-1. It'll trade with your opponent. Oftentimes, if they have a much bigger threat on their board, this will trade very well. So automatically, Boombat is very strong spot removal in general. Yes, it does get rid of itself, which then gives your opponent initiative to try and set up a new Elestral, and that can be kind of scary. So to me, because of the fact that it gives your opponent the proactive play, whereas you have to be more reactive, because the Boombat takes up your normal cast, therefore you don't have anything to protect you on the following turn. Your opponent can normal cast a new Elestral, etc. But being able to remove big threats is really great. If you manage to establish your own Elestral, Boombat can be used to keep your opponent down, and so because of that, I would say Boombat is a 7 out of 10. Sonic Core, on the other hand, is a 7-2. The Sonic Core's cast cannot be chained by Counter Ruins. As long as the Sonic Core is in attack position, players cannot cast Counter Ruins. So this is very similar to Leonite, where they were not able to cast Invoke Ruins. So with Sonic Core, being able to prevent stuff like the Pandora's Box and whatnot seems pretty good. I would definitely say Sonic Core to me. It depends on the game state, right? Unless your opponent is playing with a bunch of counter ruins, Sonic Core does feel a lack of value, but I would definitely say being able to stop cards like Pandora's Box, Athena, the Shield, and whatnot, I would say this is an 8 out of 10. Next up, we do have Ampup. Ampup is a 3-3. You can expend 1 electric and discard this Ampup in order to search your deck for up to 2 Ampups and add them to your hand. This seems okay. Yes, it does give you 2 additional cards in your hand. It filters your deck, so that's a bit of deck filtering. Now that I think about this, actually, the fact that this doesn't consume your normal cast and it filters your deck as well as gives you a +2, that's pretty good, actually. That reads pretty good to me. The only issue is that I see is the fact that it does come with a cost. But with the Like a Volt, it gets +2 attack for each Ampup in your Underworld, and when this destroys an opponent's Elestral, you can discard a card from your opponent's hand. So with a single Ampup in the Underworld, it does become an 8-3, or yeah, an 8-3. I think Ampup, this effect automatically, just the fact that you can filter your deck and set up for the Like a Volt very easily, I would say this is probably a 8 out of 10. Just for that reason. And then Like a Volt, it has very strong synergy with the Ampup, but because it relies solely on the Ampup, that feels a little bit bad. But 6-3 is not a bad stat line. You can buff it up very easily as well. To me, Like a Volt is probably a 7 out of 10. Because Ampup works without Like a Volt, but Like a Volt doesn't work as well without Ampup, and that's the biggest thing you have to keep in mind. All right, next up, Elechik. 4-1, when you normal cast this Elechik, you can search your deck for a Divine Ruin and add it to your hand. It's a tutor. It grabs very powerful cards. Automatically right off the bat, Elechik seems to me like a very easy 9 out of 10. Divine Ruins are very powerful cards, so being able to fetch them early game feels great. Griffuse, Electric Wind, 5-3. You can Nexus, Electric, or Wind from a Divine Ruin. When you do Special Ascend this Griffuse to Volt Tempest from your hand or deck. Right off the bat, it has strong synergy with the Elechik. Being able to immediately Special Ascend also is very fantastic, and it will Nexus. This card, to me, seems like an easy 10 out of 10. And then Volt Tempest, 13-10, you can disenchant Electric or Wind from this Volt Tempest to force an opponent to expend Triple Spirit. As long as Zeus is enchanted, this Volt Tempest cannot be targeted by an opponent's card effect. So forcing your opponent to expend Triple Spirit, it's pretty good. It's not exactly the most proactive play I would like to see. It also turns off your Volt Tempest because you do have to disenchant a little bit, but making it, and then when you do disenchant, you lose the ability to become non-targetable. So to me, if Elechik is a 9 out of 10, Griffuse is a 10 out of 10. Volt Tempest to me reads like a 8 out of 10. Wow, I cannot draw an 8 to save my life right now. And the reason why I do say that is because 13-10 is an absolutely insane stat line. It's very easy to cheat into, but the card itself is not insanely proactive, unlike the other 2 cards in the line. Next up, we do have Sparkit. Sparkit is a 4-1. You can Nexus up to 2 Electric. When you do, look at an opponent's hand and discard a card. Off the bat, card seems great. It's the Nexus for Electric, as well as being able to burn a card. Like, really good. The stat line's a little bit mediocre, but that's okay. Just for the effect alone, I would definitely say this is an 8 out of 10. And Gato Bolt, 8-3. You can target an Electric Enchanted Elestral and give it +1 attack, +1 defense for each Electric enchanting this Gato Bolt until the end phase. So usually it's going to be a +2/+2. This card seems really interesting to buff up certain Elestrals. If you target Gato Bolt, if you were to Special Ascend into that, that does mean that it would become a 10-5, which is a pretty solid stat line, especially if you're only having to ascend once. Not too shabby of a card. This also can empower additional Elestrals on your board, so you can set up really strong turns. So I would say this card, similarly to Sparkit, where being able to Nexus as well as snipe a card, Gato Bolt sets up for really bulky boards. And yes, unfortunately, it only lasts until the end of turn, so it doesn't carry on to your opponent's turn. But nonetheless, having this really big beater, I think it has a lot of value. I would say this is a 7 out of 10, only on the virtue of the fact that the effect only lasts until the end of your turn and not until the end of your opponent's turn. Now, we do have Quackle. Quackle is a 2/3. When you cast this Quackle, you can return up to 3 electrics from your underworld to your spirit deck. So this is very similar to Water's, I forget, the Sluggle or something along those lines. I forget the name. But being able to recover triple spirit is kind of nice. It's a really great recursion. Fundamentally, with the 1 cost of itself, it's a +2 overall. But aside from that, it's just a recovery card, and that seems okay. That seems very okay. To me, this reads like a 7 out of 10, purely because later into the game, being able to recover resources can be nice. Signectric. 4/6, reveal 12 electric spirits from your spirit deck in order to special ascend into Imperial. That is a super easy condition to meet. Depending on the power of Imperial, which is 8/12, +1 for each electric in your spirit deck, you can expend 1 electric in order to target and destroy a card. Automatically, Signectric is insane because of Imperial, right? Like these two together read like crazy. As long as you get a card to stick on the board to ascend into the Signectric and then ascend into the Imperial, Imperial by himself reads like a phenomenal card. Being able to pop anything, and as well as getting a bunch of additional attack power, to me, Imperial reads like a 10 out of 10 card for a boss card, and then Signectric reads like a 9 out of 12, or 9 out of 10. Only reason is because Signectric itself is not the best stat line, and yes, sometimes you're just more than likely going to special ascend directly into the Imperial, but I would like a little bit more for the card to do by itself as a more... to not rely on the Imperial, right? Because, like, for example, what if you don't have the Imperial? What if it got sniped? Or what if it got milled, etc., right? And then we do have Jolten. Jolten is a 3/2. When you cast this Jolten, search your deck for a Stadium. Automatically, very good. It tutors. You can play the Stadium in the same turn you play the Jolten. To me, this is an automatic no-brainer 10 out of 10. Yes, your opponent can play a Stadium over your Stadium, but the fact that you're still able to filter out a Stadium to begin with, and you force your opponent to have the Stadium, is really good. Astro Rabbit, 2/4. When this Astro Rabbit receives 1 or more electric, you can look at the top 3, add 1, shuffle the rest. It's a tutor. It's a really, really good tutor. The only issue is the fact that its stat line is kind of weak, and then it grabs 1 from the 3, unlike Jolten, who grabs any specific, any Stadium of your choice. Astro Rabbit, to me, reads like a 9 out of 10. Yeah, it's Pot of Duality from Yu-Gi-Oh, right? And Vicerus, 2/4. As long as this Vicerus is enchanted, Elestrals cannot attack the turn they are cast unless they are electric enchanted. This card sounds amazing, assuming you're not playing the mirror. This could be a really, really powerful floodgate against your opponent. Of course, if you were playing against the electric mirror, this card is absolutely dead. And so because of that, I would say this is an 8 out of 10 on average because of that reason. Next up, going into win, Aeromare. 4/5. Wow, that's a really crazy stat line, and my apologies, I still have stuff from last screen. Aeromare, 4/5. When you ascend this Aeromare, you can cast it as an artifact, empowering the ascension with the effect. The empowered Elestral cannot be targeted or destroyed by an opponent's Elestral effect. This card is crazy, right? 4/5 is an amazing stat line for a 1-cost Elestral, and then it equips itself to empower that Elestral even further. This seems like amazing. Like this, to me, reads like an automatic, like at least a 9 out of 10, if not a 10 out of 10. The only issue is that, yes, it does have to survive in order for you to ascend, but 4/5 seems like a really great stat line. Not to mention, you could probably buff it with a Stadium or with a Equip or something along those lines. So I would definitely say Aeromare is probably a 10 out of 10 to me. That reads amazing. Glidsdale, 7/5. Wind Elestral. You can spend one Wind Spirit in order to give this Glidsdale +5 until the end phase. As long as this Glidsdale is empowered by Aeromare, it can attack twice each battle phase. The fact that it requires you to specifically have the Aeromare is kind of unfortunate for you to get the second effect, but the fact that it becomes a 12/5 until the end phase is kind of nice. This is probably a 7 out of 10. Purely off the fact that it has to specifically be ascending over the Aeromare to get the value. If you were to ascend over anything else that isn't Aeromare, it is fundamentally just a 12/5 beater that's probably going to do 1 damage to your opponent's spirit deck at best, and then it's going to get removed on the following turn, most likely from removal, such as Boombat. Next up, we do have a Nimbug. Nimbug is a 1/1. You can expend 1 Wind Spirit in order to special ascend this Nimbug to Circoon from your hand or deck. Circoon is a 1/6. During your draw phase, you can expend 1 Wind Spirit. When you do, special ascend this Circoon to Stratomoth from your hand or deck. And then Stratomoth is a 9/5. This Stratomoth gets +1 attack for each Nimbug and Circoon on your field and in your underworld. You can expend 1 Wind in order to return each Ruin on an opponent's field to their hand. What? I mean, this is just Ascension, Ascension, Ascension. So Nimbug alone automatically goes into Circoon, which immediately puts this at a 10 out of 10. Actually, I take it back. It's a 9 out of 10, bare minimum, because the stat line itself is very weak. But being able to immediately ascend into Circoon, who is a 1/6, is a phenomenal turn 1 play. It's unlikely that a 1/6 is going to be defeated, so again, this to me reads like a 9 out of 10. Just because purely off the virtue of the fact that your opponent may be able to remove the Circoon, because it does have to wait a single turn. And then Stratomoth. Stratomoth itself, unfortunately, doesn't have the biggest payout, unlike cards like the Trifernal. 95 is a really great stat line. It bounces back ruins. It can get pretty beefy. I like Stratomoth. The only issue is the fact that it can only bounce back. It can only bounce back ruins. It doesn't remove the ruins off the board. It bounces it back so your opponent can reuse them. To me, that can be a bit problematic. So, you know, pretty good overall. Very good cards. Next up, we do have P-Gust. When this P-Gust receives one or more Wind Spirits, you can target and destroy a ruin. This is basically Mystical Space Typhoon on legs. Automatically, this seems like a really good card. Assuming your opponent doesn't have a ruin, yes, you do lose value, but overall, 8 out of 10. Fowlicane, 7/3. You can expend 1 Wind Spirit in order to destroy all ruins, or expend double Wind in order to destroy each ruin on an opponent's field. I mean, this seems pretty good. Being able to destroy back row like that is really good. Of course, your opponent doesn't have any back row. Then the card feels a bit redundant, or not even redundant, but not as potent. But I will say, for board clear, it's an 8 out of 10. Next up, we do have Sorlet. Sorlet is a 5/1. You can expend 1 Wind Spirit in order to change the position of an Elestral unless it is Wind Enchanted. Sorlet automatically, to me, reads very strong just because of the fact that creatures generally don't have both strong attack and defense. It's one or the other usually. Yes, it's useless in the mirror matchup, but that's okay. To me, Sorlet reads like a very easy, at the bare minimum, 7 out of 10. Oops, 7 out of 10? That looks like 7 times 10. Sorlet's that good. And then Crysaor, 8/4. This Crysaor can attack an opponent's spirit deck directly. When this deals damage to an opponent, you can return up to 2 Wind Spirits from your underworld to your spirit deck. So it is a recursion. It attacks directly for 2 damage to their spirit deck. That's nifty and everything, but other than that, it's not exactly the most proactive card. And then if you do attack their spirit deck directly, that does mean you're not going to be removing a body from their board. So to me, Crysaor reads like a 7 out of 10. I can see the idea. I understand what it's going for, but there are a lot stronger cards you can probably ascend into. So Carrion, 3/3. When this Carrion is destroyed by battle, you can target the Elestral that destroyed it, then take control of that Elestral and move it to your Elestral roll until the end phase. The fact that it only lasts until the end phase and not until the end of the next turn does mean that you don't get to use the Elestral that you steal. So to me, this seems very mid. This is probably a 2 out of 10. Outside of stealing your opponent's Elestral to prevent lethal, it seems okay. Pelaquarius. When you normal cast as Pelaquarius, you can search your deck for an Elestral with an enchantment cost of water added to your hand. It's a tutor. It invites you to play dual color. It's pretty nifty. 3/4, not the worst stat line. But the fact that you have to build specifically for it, I would say this is a 6 out of 10. And then Exaltair, 3/2. You can Nexus up to 2 win. When you do, your opponent must expend double spirit. Again, this is the Nexus for the deck. Automatically, being able to Nexus means you're an 8 out of 10 off the bat. And then forcing your opponent to expend double wind is pretty nice. So I guess the idea behind wind is you want to force your opponent to expend additional spirits. And that's a pretty interesting strategy because, again, their health is their resource. Now we're going on into the non-Elestrals. So the Divine for Earth, Demeter. When you cast this Demeter, you can enchant up to 3 Earth Spirit to it. You can disenchant 1 Earth Spirit from this Demeter in order to give an Elestral +3 attack, +3 defense to an Elestral until the end phase. So it's, first of all, it's up to 3 Earth Spirits, so you don't necessarily need to commit that hard. But more importantly, the fact that the 3/3 is not once per turn, you can make some really big bodies. Demeter, to me, reads absolutely crazy, to be honest. I like this card a lot. I would say giving additional stats, it doesn't necessarily give additional spirit, so the damage you're inflicting is not increased, but being able to beat over certain things is fantastic. I would say this is an 8 out of 10. If stats alone can only go so far, right? Scythe of Demeter, however, is a +2/+3, and when you destroy an Elestral, you can return a Earth Spirit from your underworld to your spirit deck. If Demeter is enchanted, return 2. this card is amazing. It recovers your resources. 2-3 is an absolutely fantastic stat line. I think this is a 10 out of 10 card. I like this card a lot. Earthquake, 2 cost, target and destroy an Elestral. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I don't think there's a lot to complain about. This seems like a very strong card. The fact that you can cast this during your turn and your opponent only has so much room to react to it seems really good. Foamy Forest. Elestrals get +1 attack, +1 defense for each earth enchanting them. Again, this is really good. If you're able to Nexus efficiently, you are able to get pretty good. Earth, to me, just seems like the stat check deck. When you have cards like Demeter, Scythe of Demeter, etc., it's a literal stat check deck. And so having this ability seems overall very, very good. I will say the fact that it's a +1/+1 for every enchanting earth in them, specifically that does mean you have to ramp up a little bit, but overall, I definitely would say this is at least an 8 out of 10. Yeah. Coming up next, we do have Fire, Hephaestus. When you cast as Hephaestus, you can enchant up to 3 fire spirits to it. You can disenchant 1 fire spirit from this Hephaestus in order to search your deck for an artifact and add it to your hand. This is absolutely insane in the early game, being able to grab whatever artifact you may need, and the Hammer of Hephaestus itself, +1 attack for each enchanted ruin on your field. As long as Hephaestus is enchanted, the empowered Elestral cannot be targeted by an opponent's effect, or opponent Elestral effect. The two go hand in hand with one another, absolutely crazy. Hephaestus giving the Hammer what is fundamentally +3 attack and immunity. Hammer of Hephaestus is a 9 out of 10, solely because it relies on having additional enchantments, as well as only being immune to Elestral effects, and Hephaestus himself is a 9 out of 10. Unlike Demeter, who proactively gives you additional stats, that's not once per turn, Hephaestus does grab specific pieces. The two are absolutely insane together. It reads, Eruption, an opponent must expend triple spirit. If they control a fire enchanted Elestral, they must expend 1 spirit instead. The card seems kind of mid, not gonna lie. Not the biggest fan of it. 5 out of 10. Volcanic Forge. Each Elestral gets +1 attack, +1 defense for each fire enchanting them. So again, this is basically the Foamy Forest. And that's totally fine and everything. It gets a very basic 8 out of 10. But to me, Fire doesn't seem much like a stat stick deck, unlike Earth is. So do keep that in mind when you're playing around all of this. I think mostly you're going to be playing around Hephaestus and Hammer of Hephaestus a lot. Now, going into water, Poseidon is the Divine Ruin for this deck. When you cast this Poseidon, you can enchant up to 3 water spirits. You can Nexus a water from this Poseidon. Poseidon is able to increase the amount of damage that you're outputting onto the board. Has strong synergy with Atlantis, for example. Poseidon to me reads like a very easy 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10, to be honest. I think this is more so an 8 out of 10, just because it does rely on you having a pre-established board to get a lot of value. Poseidon, unlike Hephaestus or unlike Demeter, doesn't necessarily create winning game states out of nothing. Poseidon relies on the fact that he has to have some sort of synergy with other cards. Thinking back on it, Demeter is actually probably an 8 out of 10, but for the sake of this, I would definitely say Poseidon is actually a 7 out of 10. Trident of Poseidon is a +2, cannot be targeted by counter ruins, and Poseidon is enchanted. Opponents cannot cast counter ruins. This is a pretty good card overall, being able to disable counter ruins in general. The +2 style line isn't exactly the most fantastic in comparison to Hephaestus and Demeter's, but nonetheless, turning off counter ruins is pretty good. Tsunami. Change all Elestrals to defense position unless they are water enchanted. This card doesn't do a lot into opponents that are already in defense position, nor the mirror. So to me, this reads like it's very okay. It's better than Eruption for sure. So I'll give it a 7 out of 10. And then Atlantis. Atlantis is better than the Foamy Forest. It's better than whatever Fires was, simply because of Poseidon, making it so you're going to have a much easier time going for the Nexus play. So to me, Atlantis is more so like a 9 out of 10 because of the synergy with Poseidon. Next up, we do have Electric. Zeus is, when you cast a Zeus, enchant up to 3 electric spirits. You can disenchant Electric from the Zeus in order to target an opponent's Elestral and give him -3 attack, -3 defense. So similar to Demeter, Demeter was able to increase your own stat line by a certain amount. Zeus, however, decreases. And then the Thunderbolt of Zeus, +2 attack. When you destroy an Elestral in battle, that opponent must expend a spirit. If Zeus is enchanted, must expend a double spirit. So Demeter increases stats, whereas Zeus decreases stats. They fundamentally are the same thing, but in the grand scheme of things, I definitely would say that they're pretty like within the ballpark of each other. I would say, like I said before, I would probably bump up Demeter's score to a 9 out of 10, and so by that logic, I think Zeus is a 9 out of 10. Thunderbolt of Zeus is only a +2 attack, and it doesn't have any super additional bonuses. Like Hephaestus was giving +3 average on attack, Demeter gave you back resources, Poseidon prevented counter ruins, Zeus forces your opponent to expend additional spirits, which is kind of nifty. It's not bad at all. And then just in general, equips are very strong, burning resources. I think this is an 8 out of 10. Thunderstorm, target and destroy ruin. Sweet, short, very simple, 8 out of 10. And then Mount Olympus is just like all the other field ruins. And I don't see a lot of ways that you can Nexus outside of the mandatory 1 Nexus everything gets. So again, 8 out of 10. And then we do have Aeolus. When you cast as Aeolus, enchant up to 4 Wind Spirits. You can disenchant double Wind from this Aeolus in order to search your deck for an Elestral with an enchantment cost of 1 and add it to your hand. So it's a tutor. This can grab you cards such as the Aeromare to start setting up your plays and whatnot. I can definitely see this being a pretty solid card, actually. I think this is a 9 out of 10. This is probably one of the stronger ones just because of the fact that you are able to tutor out for card advantage. Bag of Winds. The Empowered Elestral gets +2 defense and cannot be targeted by an opponent's ruin. When an Aeolus is enchanted and the Empowered Elestral destroys an Elestral in battle, you can target and destroy a ruin. So Wind does a lot of back row removal, bouncing, popping, etc. Bag of Wind is only a + defense and it cannot be targeted by a ruin. This is probably one of the weaker equips to me. And I would say, nonetheless, it is an equip, so 8 out of 10. Tornado. Target a ruin on an opponent's field, return it to your hand. So it does bounce it. It doesn't necessarily remove the ruin completely. Yes, it helps you play around counter ruins, and that's pretty strong overall. So I would say this is probably an 8 out of 10, just because you can also interfere with your opponent's stat line effects. And then Island of Aeolia. +1 attack, +1 defense for each Wind enchanted them. Pretty simple, straightforward. Yeah. Now, getting into the different type of ruins in the game of Elestral, there are a multitude of types. There are Invoke ruins, which are basically spell cards. There are Counter ruins, which are trap cards. Field ruins, which are Stadium ruins that are field spells. There is Artifact ruins, which is equip spells. And then there's Divine ruins, which act as the big gods that help you out during the game. And these ruins all do a variety of different effects. They're all pretty powerful, and these are usually your tech cards that you can splash here and there because they're very versatile in what they do. So the first ruin that we're going to look at is the Necklace of Harmonia. It is an artifact ruin that is 2 rainbow spirits, so any 2 spirits that will pay the cost. The Empowered Elestral is +5 attack. During their end phase, the controller of the Empowered Elestral must expend 2 spirits. If they cannot, this Necklace of Harmonia is destroyed. So this fundamentally acts like a curse of a sort. So the +5 attack is really fantastic, right? You just get a really big beefy attacker, and this works on either player's turns, or either player's creatures, right? So if you equip your own Elestral with it, then you get a really nice stat stick. If you equip your opponent's Elestral with it, then they have to start getting rid of 2 spirits per turn. And for them to get rid of Harmonia, what ends up having to do is you either have to ascend over the creature, in which case it would remove the Necklace of Harmonia because it's no longer the same Elestral, or you can use a ruin to get rid of it, right? Such as, I think it's Tornado or Cyclone. It's the 1 in Wind. So because of that, Necklace of Harmonia has a lot of counterplay built into it, and it's hard to say whether or not the +5 attack is worth the expend 2. I think this is very gimmicky in the grand scheme of things. You only have a certain amount of card space that you can really afford, and because of that, Necklace of Harmonia doesn't seem super worth it in terms of the slots. So I would definitely say this card, to me, it gives you +5 attack, so to me it's a 5 out of 10. And then Altar of Stars is a counter ruin, Nexus 1 Spirit. If you do, you can change the position of an Elestral. This works for both Elestrals on both players' sides, so that's really fantastic. It's a 1 cost and you Nexus 1. Altar of Stars seems like an amazing counter ruin that gives you a lot of versatility in your plays. In simplified game states, especially in early game sets, being able to manipulate battle position is really key to the game of Elestral. So I think Altar of Stars at a first glance, and the fact that it also Nexuses as well, I think this is a 10 out of 10 counter ruin. Like, I would be more than happy to play 3 copies of this card. Pandora's Box, it's a double Rainbow Ruin, counter ruin. When an opponent activates an effect that searches for or special casts a card from their deck, negate that effect, and that opponent must send the top 2 cards from their deck to the underworld. So Pandora's Box is a really interesting card to talk about. So on paper, it looks like an absolutely amazing card. It reads really, really, really strong, right? Being able to negate a search or a special cast and whatnot, it's pretty fantastic. Not only that, but you also mill 2 cards from your opponent's deck. The downside of Pandora's Box is that if your opponent anticipates this card, they will be able to play around this a little bit, or if, for example, your opponent doesn't play a deck that actually does a lot of searching or special casting, then Pandora's Box fundamentally becomes, useless. So an example that I could definitely see is if you were playing against an opponent who's just, he's aware of what Pandora's Box is going to do. And so instead of casting his searches or special cast, he can look to, for example, miscast and just not proc the effect, or he can just choose not to pay the cost of the effect. And by doing so, he plays on Pandora's Box, so you can't negate the effect, and then he retains that card on their board. But I think for the majority of the early game of Elestral, I think Pandora's Box will get a lot of value just because people will not be used to playing around it. That's just kind of the case with trap cards or counter cards in general, is the fact that a lot of players will take time to get used to playing around it, and until they do, it's going to be a little tricky. So I will say Pandora's Box, as of right now, is a 9 out of 10 just because of what it brings to the table. It puts your opponents on their toes. At worst, you can use it as a bluff. The existence of Pandora's Box itself is a bluff. If your opponent anticipates Pandora's Box, they may play around it, even though you don't have it set. Maybe you have an Altar of Stars set, right? But again, it does have counterplay that is very, once you get used to it, you can start playing around it. And then Charon's Obol is also a counter ruin. Until the end phase, when an Elestral is destroyed by battle, you draw a card. So this is a very reactive card. It gives your opponent a lot of the initiative in the sense that they can choose whether to continuously destroy additional Elestrals after the initial cast, or if they just want to back off a little bit. You can argue oh, my opponent won't swing into my Elestral, or they won't destroy my Elestral because they're scared of giving me an additional card. Well, the one card that you initially get off of the draw is you breaking even on Charon's Obol. However, it's not necessarily breaking even because you had to pay 2 cards. Sorry about the Steam notification in the bottom right hand corner, but you had to pay a 2 spirit cost initially to pay the cost of Charon's Obol, and this is also taking up room in your deck to begin with, and I'm not a fan of that. This card is not very proactive. It doesn't do a lot, and it's not like it actually interrupts your opponent's game plan. For 1 Elestral destroyed, it's a break even. 2 Elestrals destroyed, it's a +1, but also you pay double spirits. I don't know, it's just not worth it. It seems like a very mediocre card. To me, this is a 4 out of 10, and I feel like even that is kind of generous. I would say this is, honestly, on average, it's probably like a 3 out of 10. Alright, and now getting into some more Invoke Ruins, we do have Nectar of the Gods. Nectar of the Gods is draw 2 cards. It's basically Pot of Greed. And I've seen a lot of debate about this card, interestingly enough. So the reason why I see a lot of debate about this card is I see a lot of people, I was browsing the different discords and whatnot for Elestrals, and they're like, Nectar of the Gods is bait. One half of the discord is Nectar is bait, and then the other half is Nectar is broken, Nectar is insane. And so in the few games that I was able to play a little bit of Elestrals, Nectar of the Gods felt pretty impactful. Essentially what Nectar of the Gods is, it's a free +1, right? There's no strings attached to it. You don't have to meet any fancy conditions. It is a straight up +1, which in card games, a +1 is fantastic. There's a reason why Pot of Greed is banned in Yu-Gi-Oh! And if you notice, hand size in Elestral is actually very, very small. Because hand size in Elestral is so small for the most part, and the amount of cards that allow you to draw feels very limited, or it's very restricted in how you achieve that. Because of that, Nectar of the Gods feels like a pretty powerful card. being able to unconditionally draw 2 at the cost of 2 spirits. Like, yeah, 2 spirits sucks, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it's a +1. It's an unconditional +1. As a card game player, I love drawing cards. I love tempoing. Nectar of the God fundamentally makes it so you're not playing a full max deck. You're playing -3 cards, because it's -3 Nectar of the Gods, right? Because the Nectar of Gods is basically just a cycle. So if you look at it that way, it's just a free consistency boost across the board. It's like why people played Upstart Goblin in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pot of Greed, right? And then if you look at a Digimon, then cards like Boring Storm don't see play, even though Boring Storm is a draw 1. But Boring Storm is a draw 1, and Boring Storm also costs you memory, whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh! Draw cards like Upstart Goblin and Pot of Greed, they don't cost you an actual resource, necessarily. Nectar of the Gods, it costs you 2 spirits, but spirits isn't like memory in Digimon, where it actively stops you from playing the game. It's a pretty Z cost. I don't know. To me, I could be very wrong. I think Nectar of the Gods is probably just a 10 out of 10. This card reads phenomenal, just for the amount of plus. Circle the Sky is a Invoke Ruin, Nexus up to 2 spirits if you do draw a card. I mean, it's pretty straightforward and simple, right? Being able to Nexus 2 spirits gives you a lot of leeway. It can help you set up some of your Ascension plays in the future. It can help you set up a couple of just like powering up with your field spells and whatnot, and then additional draw cards so you use a break even at break even at worst. Overall, Circle the Sky, pretty good card. The fact that it says Nexus up to 2 does mean that you can Nexus up to 1, for example, and then you would still get the card draw, as far as I'm aware. So with that being said, I think this is a good card all around. I guess it really depends on how relevant going for the Nexus as a whole is in the grand scheme of things. I imagine pretty important. It feels pretty important, given the fact that going for the Nexus is so limited in what you can do. It also lets you speed up some of your Ascension process. So I definitely would say Circle the Sky for what it is. I think it's a 7 out of 10. So the reason why I say it's 7 out of 10 is because Circle the Sky feels like a card that, as a standalone, isn't very strong. It relies on other pieces in your hands to capitalize on its power. Because, like, for example, if you were to Nexus 2 cards to, say, a Elestral or a Artifact or whatever it may be, and then your opponent gets rid of the card that you just Nexused, then you lose Circle the Sky value. It was fundamentally for nothing outside of, like, a break-even. And that's not super dandy, frankly. Not a complete fan of that. So I would definitely say that Circle the Sky, it has to be accompanied by a card that will immediately give you value. So accompanied with a normal cast, with the Ascension, whatever it may be, right? You have to be on top of that. So because it's not a card that standalone is strong, it's a card that together in tangent with another card is strong. That's where Circle the Sky loses some points for me. Rise from the Ashes is a 3-cost rainbow. Target an Elestral in your underworld, special cast it in attack position. So if your opponent, hypothetically, were to, pop your board, what you can do is you can use Rise from the Ashes, revive an Elestral from your trash, and then you can ascend on top of that Elestral. So to me, Rise from the Ashes is a pretty good card. It's a really great failsafe. If you have an Elestral that gets an effect whenever you equip it with a spirit or enchant it with a spirit, it's a free plus more or less. Albeit 3 cost for spirit is pretty hefty. Yeah, it's pretty hefty. The cost itself is very heavy, but the effect is very strong. It reminds me very much so of like Call of the Haunted. I would say Monster Reborn, but Monster Reborn is a bit too free in comparison to this. Call of the Haunted, I feel like, is a more appropriate of a choice. If not, like maybe like I wouldn't say Shuffle Reborn or anything like that, but yeah, like something along the veins of Call of the Haunted, right? Even though it's an Invoke Ruin. But overall, I think Rise from the Ashes, and I could be very wrong about this, but I think it's an 8 out of 10 purely because of the fact that that should be a 10, I swear. Purely because of the fact that it gives you very easy access to Ascension, and if your opponent isn't expecting this card, they might just get taken off guard. Not every element of Elestral in this game has access to easy Ascension fodder. Some colors just do not have that luxury. For example, if you notice, Earth doesn't have a lot of ways to special cast Elestrals, whereas colors like Water or Electric, for example, they do have a fair amount of ways to special cast their Elestrals, and so Rise from the Ashes kind of helps compensate for those decks. And then Drops of Leaf, reveal any number of cards from your hand, then shuffle them into your deck, and draw that many cards. +1. This is Card Trader, and I hate Card Trader, because it's a useless card. It builds your deck better, right? That is literally what it comes to. Elestrals has a mulligan system, by the way. So there really is no need for this card. So 2 out of 10. It's just a waste. And now we get to the last ruins. Shield of Achilles. This is a counter ruin. When an opponent's Elestral declares an attack, you can negate that attack and return that Elestral to their hand. I mean, this is just insane, right? This is very easy interruption. It gets rid of the body. Unlike Altar of the Stars, or the one that changes the battle position, that doesn't get rid of the threat. Shield of Achilles does, however. And because it actually gets rid of the threat, this is a 10 out of 10 card. This is an amazing card. And then Helios' Chariot Ride. This Helios' Chariot Ride can only be cast during the draw phase. Opponent cannot cast ruins this turn. So this is a very meta card, like a heavy meta read card, where you have to predict the fact that your opponents will look to cast a ruin. If they're not looking to cast a ruin, then the card is kind of dead. How I see Helios' Ruin is that you're using it to deny your opponent going into an artifact, or deny going into a stadium, or going into a divine. Something along that vein. It's very unlikely that they're going to look to instant cast something along the lines of an invoke ruin. Like, maybe they do, and that's not like too far-fetched, but I think realistically speaking, in a simplified game state, you're going to be looking to cast something that buffs their own creatures. Not every element has access to cards like the Earthquake, right, which will just pop in Elestral. If you do anticipate cards like Earthquake, then sure, go for it. Helios Chariot Ride, like, go crazy, man. But realistically speaking, you're using it to deny stat buffs, right? So I think Helios' Chariot Ride, if a very well-timed Helios' Chariot Ride, mind you, I think is a very good card. But a poorly timed one, it's not great. So because I feel like Helios' Chariot Ride is probably the trickiest ruin to play, just in terms of like reading the game flow and reading what your opponent may be looking to do, I would say this is probably a 7 out of 10. It has the potential, it's very much so a meta card that depending on how the meta shapes, it may gain more value, but in terms of simplified games, it may just fall flat, so we'll see. So that is the end of Pro Digimon Player Rates, set 1 of Elestrals. I will definitely say this game seems actually really, really interesting. The resource system is pretty cool. The fact that your health and all your costs are tied in hand with one another, and your opponent has a direct way to influence that resource themselves by attacking you or burning it, etc. The card game has a lot of passion behind it. I've spoken with aDrive directly, and he has put a lot of time, a lot of effort into this card game, and it seems absolutely phenomenal. I'm really happy to see this card game finally come to life. I hope for nothing than the best for that. Really, really soon, I think today actually, there is going to be a Kickstarter that you all can support if you're interested in the game. You can pick up a Founders Edition for the initial base set. I will definitely say if you're looking for a more simplified game that's easy to pick up but also has quite a bit of elements of strategy and can get more complex as you progress through it, I would definitely say Elestrals is a pretty great game. But yeah, if this is a passion game, aDrive has been very vocal about feedback. I've had nothing more than good experiences talking with this person, and just in general, they've taken a lot of feedback. They're very open with their community, and that's something that a lot of card games, that's what we want, right? We want an open line with the community, with the developers. And so I think if you're looking for that kind of environment, Elestrals is going to be a really great game. So thank you all so much for watching. This has been Hoang Zero, and take it easy. Don't forget to check in the description for the link to the Kickstarter where you will be able to check out the game.